Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Department of Education's Literacy Knowledge Building video series. In this video, Dr. Maryanne Wolf from the University of California, Los Angeles, Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice will discuss the science behind reading and dyslexia. She is the author of Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, and most recently, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. She has received the highest honors from dyslexia organizations and most recently has been elected to the Pontifical Academy of Science. Before we begin, let's go over a brief bit of background on the Literacy Knowledge video series. This is a series of videos on critical topics in literacy, birth through grade 12. It is developed by the California Department of Education and literacy experts in the state literacy team, and it is complementary to the work of the Federal Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant. You can learn more about the CLSD grant by going to the California Department of Education's website and searching for CLSD. The purpose of this video series is to provide guidance and resources on critical topics in literacy, to support the work of the CLSD grants, and to build coherence between California's literacy guidance documents, standards, and frameworks, and how they all support literacy. A major objective of the CLSD grant is to bring coherence between California's guiding documents, some of which you see here, like the California Preschool Learning Foundations, the Infant Toddler Learning and Development Foundations, the Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, the Dyslexia Guidelines, and the English Learner Roadmap Policy. Other content area standards and frameworks support literacy as well. The videos produced in this series will illustrate the connections between all of these documents and also explain how the documents themselves support literacy development for our students. Videos will be produced over the course of the CLSD grant period. To be informed when new videos are posted, join the CLSD listserv by sending a blank email to join-california-literacy-states-development-program at mlist.cde.ca.gov. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Maryanne Wolf.
Hello to all of you. I hope very much that some of you who are viewing, or most of you are viewing this, will have had a chance to have heard my earlier overview of the science of reading, because today's is to take a special slice of the science of reading and talk about some of the research that is ongoing about dyslexia. But if you remember, those of you who heard my other one, the cerebral diversity that dyslexia represents is about the fact that our brain needs to have different organizations or our species can't evolve. If everybody had a brain that was as linear as mine, we would never have discovered a wheel. I don't have that kind of brain. But the reality is that our adults and individuals and children with dyslexia have inherited a different organization of that brain that goes well before literacy was ever invented. So what I want you to begin with is this concept. The human race has many different organizations that are necessary for us to evolve and survive. But the brain of a dyslexic has some particular strengths and weaknesses. And this brief talk with you is about some of those differences. Whether we call it neurodiverse learners as a large group with dyslexia subset, or as I do, that area of children who are neurodiverse who have different forms of dyslexia. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, what most of this research is coming from are my colleagues around the world. But we are in our UCLA Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice, applying that set of knowledge bases to our work in the schools in LA Unified, with our colleagues in San Francisco, in a collaboration with the California State University Schools of Education. In particular, I want to thank Sue Sears from CSUN, Northridge, and all of my colleagues who are working on this collaboration, Laura Reinhardt and so many others. And we're all working to bring this knowledge to you. So today we're going to take a slice of it and talk about some of the things that I want to be sure that you know. The first is that neuroscience, which is my area, cognitive neuroscience, is really illustrating not just the weaknesses that we have all been challenged with in both diagnosing and intervening, but also the strengths. So in that first video with you, I talked about Leonardo da Vinci as an example of the apex of strengths and weaknesses. But the work of people like Hoeft and Mary Lou Gorno-Tempini and some of my colleagues at Stanford and UCLA, we're all after the mix of strengths and weaknesses and the protective factors and what makes some of our children resilient. So one of the very important aspects is that you realize this brain was actually showing some of its differences from infancy. You will see that some of the research that's going on at UCSF and my colleagues at Harvard and MIT, Nadine Gabb, for example, as well, they are doing work on looking at the brains of our infants from families who have a history of dyslexia. So we are combining research bases in neuroimaging across time, and we're combining that with some of our work in genetics, but we're putting all of this together with very different forms with our behavioral measures to try to get over time this long view of what dyslexia is. And if you look at the next slide, one of the fascinating aspects, and this is done by my colleague Nadine Gabb, who's now at the Harvard School of Education and has been at Children's Hospital. What we see is that there are differences in areas that are about the connectedness. Now, if you remember from my first talk, I spoke about the reading brain as the development of a circuit with component parts. Well, what we see in some of Nadine Gabb's work and others is that some of the, if you will, those areas that are about connecting the parts are different, less robust in their in the ways that they develop that we can see at infancy. So you get a sense that some of this research is showing us from the very start how that organization of the brain is different. So as we know, over the last 20, 30 years, we have been able to establish what are the best known predictors of dyslexia, not just in English, but in multiple languages. And for the most part, there are two absolute best known predictors, and then there are others that we are adding. But the phoneme awareness, the ability to actually have a representation of that phoneme in that child's language, that is a predictor across all languages. It's very, very predictive in English. The reality is that phonemes are represented in areas of the brain in typical readers, and it's not the same regions of representation. In fact, what is happening is that the brain of a child with dyslexia is representing them more diffusely and using the right hemisphere as well as the left. And we will see that pattern across time in different predictors. The second best known predictor is one, full disclosure, my mentor, a former Harvard pediatric neurologist, then she went to Johns Hopkins, Marilyn, that's my novelist, Martha Dankla. She and Rita Riddell created the first naming speed test. And then in my dissertation at the Harvard Reading Lab, I helped redo the original and added to it what is called the RAS. So the RAN and RAS are predictors of how fast The brain can connect visual and linguistic information. If you look at this, it's so simple, and yet it is so difficult in one sense, in the sense of time. The time it takes to connect the visual and the language regions is is our best predictor in especially regular language. In English, it's, along with phoneme awareness, one of our best predictors, but it becomes an even better predictor for a subset of children. And this is where we're going to broaden our concept of dyslexia to realize dyslexia is not just one entity. And so the RAN and the RAS is when you alternate a letter to a letter number or a letter number color. And these little simple measures are extremely important for understanding who will have fluency-based issues and who will have phoneme-based issues and who will have both or multiple. And that's a story that has been evolving now over the last years. And some of my students, PhD students, have taken and run with this. So if you want to look at that slice of the brain, if you will, that's responsible for visual recognition, for the word form area, for adding phonemes, for adding meaning, what you're going to see is that in readers who are typical, they are doing something different from the children who are dyslexic. One, they do it faster. Two, they use, by and large, by the time it gets to the word form areas, they're using largely the left hemisphere. This is different for children with dyslexia. Now, that's not all children. As I said, there are differences, but by and large, what we see when we look at RAN or RAS over time, at times in terms of milliseconds in these images, what we see is both a delay and a right hemisphere that is actually doing the work of what a left hemisphere usually does. And that causes a difference in latency, which we then can look at in a behavioral test like the RAN or the RAS. One of the major things that I want to emphasize today has been written about by Nadine Gabb and my former PhD, Ola Ozernoff-Palchik. And this is a concept that we have been literally just butting our heads against a wall over for years. And that is, we know intervention is best and most efficacious when it's with the younger children, and yet children are being diagnosed largely too late, second, third, fourth grade. Every week of my life, I have a parent or educator talking to me about children who were never diagnosed in their fourth grade, fifth grade, high school. We have to change this. And that's what the most recent last 5 years of research is really pushing us towards. And we'll show you that as I said, my last PhD student in Boston, Ola Ozernoff-Palchik, and I, and John Gabriele, and Nadine Gabb, all these people in Boston, we put together, and I should say they did much more work than I ever did, but the concept was to do a prediction study, a very large prediction study at age 5, to see if we could establish profiles of risk, profiles that would be continuous over time, but that would begin to differentiate the different types or forms of reading challenge. And what Ola found, and this is an article in Developmental Science, 2016-17, and then imaging followed, we found 6 profiles of readers. Now, there will be many more than that, but just for parsimony's sake, we basically are finding 2 major types of children who are having very if you will, ordinary typical reading, one gifted, one not. So that purple line and the black line are the ordinary typical readers, but then those 4 lines next are the ones that we are most interested in. Now, if you look at the bottom, the blues, those are the ones that we can predict almost all the time from phoneme awareness and our other tasks. However, I need you to realize there's a group, the green one, that is almost like our superior, so-called superior reader. There's no statistical difference with them. They are better than our average reader in most of those indices, except RAN-RAS. That group will be the group that will go on to have fluency-based issues, and no one will pick them up till probably 3rd or 4th grade, and they'll say, where did they come from? This is the group we need to be sure that our batteries are picking up, so that RAN-RAS task is going to be, and there are many different forms of naming speed, but just to be sure that you have one that has 50 stimuli so that we can really pick up the retrieval issues. Now the red line is our reader who is below average on almost everything, but not as impaired as our more significantly clear dyslexic profiles. We do not know among those children whether it is the language impoverishment of their environment, which is likely for some, whether some of them have an orthographic deficit, likely for very little, but some, or whether it's just that they did not have a shot between 0 and 5 at developing the components that we need to work on. So even though we're going to work with them, just like we would with a hardcore dyslexic child, we know that that group is still more mysterious to us. Now, you look at the next slide, you're going to see the following year, the stability of these groups is very, very clear. That bottom blue line is our multi-deficit group. They have RAN, they have short-term memory, they have phoneme awareness, they have a lot of differences. They are the most significantly impaired, but we can get a picture of them before this happens. And that's the real point. Our early intervention is based on the idea that we can get our kids assessed in kindergarten so that we can begin ever more differentiated intervention. And we have, in a certain sense, been really a problematic field in the teaching of reading for many years because we have split up the turf of the reading brain. And in my first film for you in terms of the science of reading, I emphasized that the reading brain requires explicit, systematic, structured work, evidence-based practices on foundational skills, but alongside work on vocabulary and syntax and how words work in sentences and stories. It's not either or. And our children with dyslexia actually help us understand even more vividly why we need all that explicit work across the board. Because we have actually made a huge mistake in the 20th century by having our teachers believe that that either phonics is all you need or whole language is all you need, when you really need an approach that is absolutely phonics evidence-based approaches, but also work on vocabulary and stories and literature. It does not and should not be separated, but those foundational skills have to be automatic. And that's where a lot of mistake has taken place because people use terms like balanced, and those who are truly balanced, oh, bravo. But the reality is that often balance is a cherry picking of a little phonics here, a little phonics there, instead of systematicity. Now, the next slide is showing you what we have found works best for our children with dyslexia, but the principles underlying that research are what are good. These principles are good for all of our readers. And this work is in collaboration with two of the finest interventionists in the country and in Canada, Robin Morris in Atlanta and Maureen Lovett in Toronto. And basically for 2 decades, we did research on what is going to be the best interventions principles. We're not talking about, oh, you have to use our program or Maureen's program. No, we're talking about principles underlying our intervention. And so when I show you this, these principles come straight out of the science of reading. It means we have to emphasize all parts of the circuit that I talked about in that early series. All of that is necessary to become automatic and working on connections. So we have to develop the components so they're really systematically taught, but also systematically connected, all of those component parts. And that becomes the basis for the teaching of deep reading, which was a prominent part of my first discussion with you in terms of learning inference and critical analysis and empathy. That all becomes part of what we are doing by reverse engineering the reading brain into our interventions and choosing instruction and intervention that really encompasses all of that. So this is just one example of what we did in the research. It is by no means to tell you to use any approach. The approach that we use, called RAVE-O, is basically our attempt to get those principles of the deep reading brain into an intervention. So we used metacognitive strategies with characters like, this is Mayor Mick, who teaches the many interesting connections in words and among words. Well, that is, of course, only one of the many components we're teaching. I use this just as a tiny example. Could have used Empower's work by Maureen Lovett. All of these types of programs have one thing that is what we want to emphasize, and that is they are multi-component. Think about dyslexia. Remember what I said. Some children have only phoneme awareness, and okay, then you can just use that amount of time for instruction, emphasizing that. But that is the very smallest group. The largest group is the one with multiple deficits. And so if you use a multi-component approach, you're going to have the best chance at helping the most children. And one of the things that we discovered in our research over the last 2 decades is that we make the greatest gains in tests like Gray Oral that have both fluency and comprehension, but many tests. We've used, 20 tests. But what we find, the multi-component interventions, more than a phonics-only intervention, give us the greatest results. And if you get the next slide, makes it even more apparent. So we do growth curve analyses to see how our children are developing. And those top 2 lines are the RAVE-O and Empower interventions, which were the 2 multi-component. And below you see the grayer lines. Well, that was phonics only or good classroom instruction. And they were making gains. I'm not saying they're not. They're making good gains. But we make better gains when we have multi-component. And if you see the effect sizes, I want to put a absolute underscore. That'll never happen again. That was perfect conditions with teachers who were trained over time, and we had all the best conditions. And so I don't expect anyone to have that kind of effect size, but we got it when we had those conditions and used multiple components interventions. The other very important aspect of our research, and this is just, I can't underscore it enough, the earlier the intervention, the greater the gains. And that was across all of these different measures. Now we can, when we begin at grade 3, we can make good progress. but never as much as if we begin in grade 1. And here's one other element to what our work is so important to give. At grade 1, our children have not entered the cycle of failure or the social emotional detritus that accrues in our children when they fail publicly in front of their friends, their teachers, their family. We can help prevent that. And some of my Italian colleagues, Daniela Traficante, have taken our RAVE-O program and translated it. It's called Eureka in Italian. And they're showing that what you're doing is you are developing the sense of confidence, the sense of self, the sense of self-esteem, relationship to learning when you're giving these early interventions and in a multi-component fashion. So we know from our research, we know from the research of so many of our colleagues that early assessment, early intervention will give us our best results. And oh, this is showing my colleague from Italy. And I will repeat myself. I have never, ever been happier than when I see our children move from being worried sick that there's something different about them or that they think they're dumb because they can't learn to read like everybody else. When we eradicate that and that they know that they have a different brain organization, but that they can learn. They may not learn to be as fluent and proficient as the person who has no impediments, but we can teach them to learn and have a sense of well-being and optimism. And that's what we want to take over a lifespan. It's not just an approach that's a cognitive and linguistic approach. It's also an affective approach in our work with children. Now, I want to have the end of my work with you talking about not just children who are those diagnosed with dyslexias, but all children who struggle. And there's so many different reasons. But the work on dyslexia can help us begin to eradicate issues that are not about dyslexia, but about the fact that their environment in those first 5 years was not, in essence, enhancing their cognitive, linguistic, and affective development in the same way as others. Again, my colleague Ola Ozernoff-Palchik and others have found that the children from low socioeconomic strata have a higher risk for becoming a poor reader. That's not dyslexia. That's my red line, my basket group, if you will, who are not learning to read and may look dyslexic, but it's for other reasons. And so we really need to take seriously what we can do to provide that kind of conceptual linguistic background to our children who are coming to us from backgrounds that don't enhance or enrich it. And in the time of COVID, which this film is being made during, I am more worried than ever that we have to work hard on getting that conceptual knowledge to our children who are not getting it, or the inequities of their environment are not allowing them the same level playing field. And that same level playing field is whether we're looking at NAEP results from Los Angeles or Atlanta, we're seeing huge discrepancies in our children who are not reaching proficiency. In LA, NAEP scores are going to show you that about 41% of your Caucasian kids, national is 1/3, LA is 41, but only in the teens, the percentile of our children who are African American and Latino are reaching those proficiency levels. And here's a terrible, absolutely terrible slide in which we have children in 4th grade not reaching basic. I'm not talking about proficient, I'm talking about basic. We cannot accept this. When we talk about the study of reading, the science of reading, we are talking about social justice writ large and small for every child. And so I plead with you to understand we must change this. We who are the teachers of our children, we cannot have these kinds of percentages in our schools. My colleague, Sean Robinson, is also called Dr. Dyslexia Dude. And he and people like Julie Washington, who's coming to UC Irvine, and Corey Thompson and others, we're all really trying to figure out what we can do with our African-American boys in 4th grade who are not making it. Some because they're dyslexic and gifted, but they are not learning to read, but many because of all those inequity factors. We have to change this entire equation. So what do I suggest to all of you? 3 areas of systemic change are necessary. We need a campaign to increase language and concept development from 0 to 5. We need early assessment at age 5. We need that assessment understood by our teachers, how to take the results from these. We are actually working on a digital screener with Nadine Gabb, and also we will be working with UCSF and the Dyslexia Center there. But what we want is to get this assessment information into the hands of teachers who are trained to use that information so that they can target intervention and instruction that is ever more tailored to the needs of the children. Finally, we need to be sure that by grade 4, we have proficiency, we have fluency, we've worked systematically, explicitly with evidence-based approaches that make sure that by grade 4, our kids are automatic in their skills, so that all this deep reading that becomes ever more, if you will, sophisticated in grade 4, with teachers who by and large have not been trained through no fault of their own to deal with problems in grade 4. We need professional development across the elementary school. I would go from K to 12 so that we can recognize and know what to do across the lifespan, the school lifespan of a child. And we need this change now. And so I want to have a complete change of, if you will, the cartography for understanding the concept of dyslexia, so that our schools, for me, LA Unified, for you, wherever you are, our state initiatives, our national initiatives, and our global efforts are becoming ever more united, so that that mission of making every child around our town, our city, our state, our country, and our world is literate. That's our mission, and with your help, helping all our neurodiverse learners through some of this research on dyslexia, we will get there. The last slide is my son, the LA artist, and Leonardo da Vinci. The last slide puts together everything I believe about our children in a psalm. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. With your help, our children who are rejected will reach their potential and be the basis of future citizens who contribute to our world. Thank you so much.
Thank you for viewing the science behind reading and dyslexia. Make sure to watch the next video in the series, Making Reading Instruction Accessible for All Elementary School Students. Thank you.